Thank you, everybody. So like Andrew said, my name is Adam, and I am the Community Engagement Librarian for the Library of Michigan. I have been there I just reached my 1-year anniversary of working there. Prior to that, I spent almost 9 years working for Kent District Library over in the Grand Rapids area. And you will find that I am a lover of history and all things genealogy. So if I ever get an opportunity to come back here and speak on anything, it will likely be on those kind of topics. If you ever get a chance to come to the Library of Michigan, we are located in Lansing, just down the street from the Capitol. We're in the Michigan Library and Historical Center, which also includes the State Archives and the State Museum, so it's almost your one-stop shop for all things literary and historical for the state of Michigan. And we're open during the week and also open on Saturdays, and I certainly encourage you guys to stop by if you get a chance, because it's a fun, really cool place to certainly work at. Our oldest item is from 1490. And our rare book room has a number of other really cool old things in it, all dealing with things from Michigan. So I've given this presentation a number of different places, and I've never had as unique place like where this library is at. So I want to point out, normally I don't include this kind of slide in my presentation, but where the Salem-South Lyon District Library is located, it's sort of smack dab in the middle of 4 different counties. So unfortunately, I won't be able to talk about the poorhouses from all 4 of those counties. Some of them had to be cut. Now, I do know some things about the ones that I'm not going to be focusing on, so if you do have questions, I can kind of talk a little bit about them. You'll find the ones that we're nearby. So Washtenaw County, the Ann Arbor area is where their poorhouse used to be. Livingston County, south of Howell, in Marion Township. Oakland, theirs was in a number of different areas, but primarily in Waterford Township, northwest of Pontiac. And then Wayne, can anybody name what Wayne County's poorhouse eventually became? Eloise. So unfortunately, I will not be talking about Eloise. I have a whole different presentation that I gave on that a while ago, but so I can answer questions if people have on that. I'm primarily going to be focusing on the Oakland and Washtenaw County poorhouses. So those will be the ones, just because that's kind of the service area of Salem-South Lyon, but I do know a little bit about the other 2 if you do have questions. So there's a couple things that kind of led me to this topic. First and foremost is a number of years ago I was taking a class called the Techniques in Local and Archival History, and I had to come up with a topic to do research on for the class. It had to be something related to Grand Rapids, Kent County history, and at the time I was working at the Kentwood Library, which is just outside of Grand Rapids, and come to find out the Kent County Poorhouse was located within about a mile or 2 away from where I worked. The cemetery is still there. There's little remnants of it left, and that turned into the topic that I did research on for my final project for the class. Now that was in 2012. It's now 2020. If you talk with my parents and some other friends and family, they might say, Adam, this has kind of turned into a bit of an obsession. I think it's just a fascinating topic. And the unique thing about it is that nearly every county in Michigan had a poorhouse. The only one that really doesn't qualify is Keweenaw County, just because of the fact it was so rural, and they rented a building for a while, but primarily they were doing what was called outdoor relief at that time, which we'll get into in a little bit. And you'll find, for many of us who have family members, ancestors that have been in Michigan for many generations, you may find that you have a poor farm ancestor in your family tree. Mine is my great-great-grandmother, Hattie Oster, who was an inmate at the Grassy County Poorhouse for a number of months. This is the ledger book that lists her in it. So Hattie Oster, she was from Wheeler Township, and Says here, taken by son, so she was there for a few months, but that was primarily because she eventually made her way to the Traverse City State Asylum up in Traverse City, and that's where she spent the last few years of her life. This is a picture of the Grassy County Poorhouse. That building is still there today. It's not used by the county. It's being used as a retirement adult foster care home. But you can find examples of some of these buildings still in existence. These are some pictures of some of the other ones that existed in our state's history. Tuscola County, that was in Caro. Elder County, these are all different. I've been able to find a number of different postcards that have existed related to different poorhouses in Michigan. Kalamazoo County, that building is gone. It's now part of a county park that's in the Kalamazoo area. Midland County, this is their building. You won't find that building anymore because it's now part of the property of Dow Chemical that's in Midland. Yeah, that one of the big retention ponds that got turned into the land that the poorhouse was on was turned into one of those retention ponds. Ionia County's, theirs, if you happen to be at the Ionia State Recreation Area, that's where their poorhouse used to be. And then Jackson County's was just on the northwest side of town, and I believe that building burned down at some point. And you'll find a lot of poorhouses had that problem in their histories just because of the building materials and not really having the type of safety codes that we have today. To kind of get us into a little bit of the origins of Michigan Poor Law, I'm going to talk just about some of the basic laws that we had initially as we first were a territory and then became a state. So we became the first law that we had as a territory in Michigan was in 1805, which was the Act for the Relief of the Poor, which is based on a New Jersey law. And what that was is that it allowed a pauper to petition 3 justices of the peace alleging that such person is destitute of support and is incapable of labor. So these justices were to investigate the claim. If they found it to be true, they would grant the pauper a certificate, and if approved, the pauper became a public charge. This then outlawed the procedure for the marshal of the territory to contract with a person offering the lowest terms for the support of such pauper, provided that no contract be made for a greater sum than 25 cents for a day. So this is where we're still a very unsettled area, that Michigan wasn't even a state at this point. We're just a territory. We don't have that many people that have come in, but yet we're still finding those that are in need of some sort of help, whether they have come on hard times or have been injured in some sort of way. And so as more people come to the territory, you have to start developing rules and regulations for how to care for people, because there's no such thing in what it is today of insurance or other sorts of policies that help care for people like that we have today. A few years later in 1809, that's for the Act for the Support of the Poor, based on a Vermont law, which defined who is eligible for public support and set up the 3-member panel known as the Overseers of the Poor. You'll find this is sort of a basis for a lot of the procedures when it comes to personnel, that there's always 3 people that are in charge. This will turn into the Superintendents of the Poor, which you'll see in just a few more slides beyond this. In 1817, that's where we passed the Act for the Relief of the Poor, which allowed for children to be bound out to apprenticeships if they were poor, and then it also repealed in the 1805 law and made some other further changes. The big one that comes into effect, though, is this 1830 Act to authorize the establishment of poorhouses. This sort of sets the tone for the next few decades following this point, because what it does is it starts the requirement of where all counties had to have some sort of poorhouse in order to serve the poor, the chronically ill, the infirm people that are within their counties. So Wayne County was the first one to establish a poorhouse. That was in 1832. It was originally in Hamtramck Township, now the northwest corner of Gratiot and Mount Elliott Avenues in Detroit. And it wouldn't stay there forever. It would eventually move to to the Westland area and became the really large complex of Eloise, which had, I think, over 70 buildings. You were serving like 15,000 meals a day. It also was a psychiatric hospital and a lot of other different things going that was taking place at that facility. So now we get into the question more of what is a poorhouse, or what is a poor farm. A poorhouse is a place maintained at the public expense to house needy independent persons. Anybody who is chronically ill, who is just on hard luck, anybody who needs some sort of support that they're not getting from family or friends or from any other sort of structure at that time. A poor farm is basically a poorhouse, but in a much more rural setting, or they also would refer to it as a city farm, where they're basing its economy off of farming. This is where you would have large plots of land where they would be growing crops or other sorts of things, were to try and make it that it was a self-sustaining sort of institution. So whatever they grew on the property was what people would be either using to eat or to be sold off in order to generate some sort of funds for the facility to continue. But unfortunately, few ever turned any sort of profit. The only one that I've ever come across that actually had some sort of a profit was in I think it was Calhoun County, which Calhoun County is by the Battle Creek area, and they were somehow able to, at least for a number of years, generate some sort of a profit. But most everybody else, it was not, they were not able to do that. All able-bodied inmates were required to work. If you could work out in the fields, you would do so if you had that capability. If you were not capable of doing that type of labor, you would do everything from washing dishes to helping cook meals to doing laundry, to somehow support the functioning of the facility. You'll find that a lot of the names will sort of change over time. So if you're ever doing research on a poor farm inmate, it's good to start cataloging these types of terms. They would use everything from almshouse, house of refuge, poorhouse, poor farm, county home, county infirmary. This is just using the Kent County poorhouse as an example of when they were using the different titles over different times. So early on, it was either the Kent County poor farm or county house or county home. More starting to get closer into 1893, where it was primarily called the county home. 1917 was primarily when they started referring to it as the Kent County Infirmary. And then in the 50s, they tried to sort of deinstitutionalize that name. And because you were finding every county at that point were calling their facilities as infirmaries. And so they decided to change theirs as Maple Grove, first as Maple Grove Home and then as Maple Grove Medical Facility. If you look at other different counties that are in Michigan, like Barry, that's over in the Hastings area, they always refer to theirs as Thornapple Manor. Other ones, like Muskegon, it was referred to as Shady Acres. I think Ottawa's was Community Haven. So you'll find, starting in around the 50s, you'll find this softening tone of how they would refer to these facilities. So another important law that comes into effect is this one called Public Act 148 in 1869. This was the act to revise and consolidate the several acts relating to the support and maintenance of poor persons in Michigan. It revised and consolidated all the previous acts relating to the support and maintenance of the poor and led to the creation of this state institution that's called the State Board of Corrections and Charities. Now that we've sort of reached this era that's post-Civil War, that a lot more areas of Michigan are becoming filled with higher population density. With more population, you're going to find there's going to be a greater number of people that are in situations of poverty, being paupers, chronically ill. So this is where the state was recognizing we need to do a little bit more to kind of regulate and provide guidance to the counties of Michigan on what to do. So the State Board of Corrections and Charities was officially launched in 1871. Its primary roles was to oversee the management of the charitable, penal, and reformatory institutions of Michigan. It supervised everything from the jails, the almshouses, other kindred places of detention and shelter. It also compiled statistics relating to the dependency, delinquency, and crime. It's interesting some of the ways in which they sort of refer to all these types of things that the corrections and charities would fall under. So this is sort of that umbrella overlook of what the State Board of Corrections and Charities existed in starting in the 1870s. So we have the state of Michigan, the Board of Corrections and Charities underneath it, and this is where we start getting everything from our asylums and state hospitals. First starting with the Kalamazoo State Hospital, which came into existence in the 1850s. Other ones like Pontiac, Traverse City, the Ionia Asylum for the Criminally Insane, Lapeer, Cairo, Newberry, also the Psychopathic Hospital that was in Ann Arbor. And then we also have the Institution for the Deaf, Dumb, and the Blind. Originally, the School for the Blind was also in Lansing, but eventually they consolidated all of that into Flint. The county poorhouses, and for example, we've got the Oakland County Poor Farm here. The state public school in Coldwater, that was where, because primarily children would not be at poorhouses, they tried to keep them from being in those institutions. So they either were fostered out in the local community, or if nobody else was taking them, then they would send them to Coldwater. The Coldwater School also was taking children that had some mental disabilities, so it eventually became more of a school that had that as a primary focus. And then we also have the reform school. So the state boys school was in Lansing, just on the sort of just northeast of where the Capitol is right now. And then the school for girls was in Adrian. And then lastly, we have our state prisons, which is Jackson, Ionia, and Marquette. So all of these institutions fell under the State Board of Corrections and Charities. Most of these are all state-level institutions, but they provided guidance to the poorhouses even though they were at the county level. So now let's look at what the structure is at the county level. We have our superintendents of the poor. When I mentioned earlier about that number of 3 officials, this is where it kind of gets into more prominence. We have the 3 elected officials that oversaw the county's poor department. Their role was to investigate the claims of individuals that applied for relief. Something that isn't always consistent amongst every county is that in some counties, these positions were separate elected positions. So if somebody was trying to get their foot wet into county government, people would apply for it to run for office, get the position, maybe be in it for a few years, and then use that to launch themselves into other positions, whether it be on the Board of Supervisors or some other sort of position in local government. Now, other places, I found that Genesee County, what they did is they took 3 members of their Board of Supervisors and assigned them the role of also being the superintendents of the poor. So that can vary from place to place, but for the most part, you're going to find them being elected officials for that department. We then have our poor farm keeper or overseer. The names will sometimes be interchangeable. And their role was to supervise the operations of the county poor farm. They would live on site at the facility. The superintendents of the poor would not be on site other than occasionally there for seeing what's going on with the facility to check in with the poor farm keeper, but primarily they were not there very often unless they were bringing somebody to or from there. The poor farm matron, this would be typically the keeper's wife who would assist with the poor farm's female inmates. But if the keeper was unmarried or they didn't have somebody in that position, it was primarily the keeper who was having to take care of anywhere between 8 to 30 people all on their own, and some of them with mental disabilities. It wasn't always an easy process for them. Some other definitions that are important to know about when it comes to this whole structure, outdoor relief. This is the assistance in the form of money, food, clothing, or other goods given to alleviate poverty without the requirement that the recipient enter into an institution. This is sort of our early versions of what we now have as the type of welfare type of support that we give today. Now, this can be, like it says, money or food or clothing, but there's other things that we would do as well that you would find some county officials doing. Like, say you've got somebody who is a pauper and they're living in, I don't know, in the South Lyon area, and they happen to have a brother that lives in Detroit. Well, what the county official will do is they'll say, here, let me give you a train ticket. We'll pay for the ticket and allow you to go to where your brother lives in Detroit, and then they can support you rather than having to use public funds to support them in the county itself. Indoor relief, this is where we have the actual institutional housing of the poor, the chronically ill, or the mentally handicapped. So we identify somebody who has no means of support. Either their family does not want to take care of them, or there just is nobody who can help them, and that's where we transfer them to an actual poorhouse or poor farm. Something else that's important too is recognizing where non-residents fit into this. So non-residents are anybody who has been in a county less than a year. If they have been less than a year in the county, they are either going to be transported to the county of their last origin, or the county of origin that they came from will be charged for the relief services that they're receiving. So somebody that is here in Washtenaw County, we're right on the border, and somehow they happen to end up in Pontiac for some reason, and they're there for a few months and they get hurt in some way. Well, what they will likely do in Oakland County is they'll say, no, you've got to go down to the Ann Arbor area where their poorhouse is at. We're going to send you down there because you haven't paid any tax dollars into our services. So that is something that has been going on for a long time, even going back to colonial days. They would even have these things where they would have the warning outs. They would basically say to somebody who has been a perpetual pauper in an area for quite a while, or has shown up and they're recognizing them as somebody who might be there for a while, they'll say to them, you need to leave. You need to get out of our town. You need to go back to where you came from. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are instances in the early history of Michigan where things like that may have existed. Looking more just at the structure at the local level, we have the Oakland County Board of Supervisors, or Washtenaw County. It's interchangeable there. Our 3 superintendents of the poor, our poorhouse keeper or overseer. You'll see this one line here, which is for the visiting physician. Oftentimes they will contract with a physician within the county to provide some sort of medical services for people who are at the institution. They were not there on a daily basis. It would be either weekly or monthly, and oftentimes it would be the lowest bidder, so you weren't exactly getting the best of health care if you were going to be at the poorhouse. But you are at least getting a roof over your head and 3 square meals a day. We also have the poorhouse matron, and then sometimes they would also have a hired-on laborer. Over time, as these institutions would grow, either in both size or the number of people that were there, you would then have hired hands, either of people who were there as paupers and had the capability of being hired on, or they would have external people that were hired in to help out. And then I also list over here on the side where we have the cities and townships, and this is just showing where the money went to pay for all of this. So we have our county poor fund, where cities and townships would take tax dollars, it would go into that, and then would pay for the poor fund for the superintendents of the poor and the poorhouse. But then they would often have their own local poor fund. In some counties in early Michigan history, it was primarily the cities and townships that would be distributing outdoor relief. It wouldn't be for some of them until later on. Oakland County is an example of that, where they transitioned from it being done at a township and city level to the county level. But you will find in some treasury treasurer records of townships and cities in Michigan were able to put a separate line of outdoor relief. Maybe you might get lucky and they actually have the names of the people who they were giving money to if you were trying to track down an ancestor who may have been in a situation of poverty. So now let's get into the two poorhouses that we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on Washtenaw and Oakland County just because they're the ones that are primarily the closest to here. So with Washtenaw County, they purchased, the county purchased property in Pittsfield Township for $1,200 in Section 3. So this is on the north side of Pittsfield Township. To put that in an idea of where that is now today, Ann Arbor is going to be right here. So it's just to the southeast side of where Ann Arbor is. They paid $1,200 to a guy by the name of Claudius Britton for the purposes of a poorhouse in 1836. The property initially came with 128 acres, and then they would purchase another 13 acres afterwards in Section 34 of Ann Arbor Township. So just right up here to the top, they would have another little section. So that would end up being 141 acres of property that they would have for the majority of the time the facility existed. They constructed both a poorhouse and an insane asylum on the property, which is in many ways kind of unique. Normally in other counties it would be just a poorhouse. Maybe they would also have either a pest house, or Kent County, they referred to it as an idiot's house that was like 200 feet away from the main building in order to separate the cases of people that were more harder to deal with mental disabilities away from the general population. But when you look at kind of an early description, this is from a state document, documents accompanying the Journal of the House of Representatives of the state of Michigan in 1849. It talks about 128 acres purchased in 1837. The building erected on said farm since the purchase costs $4,350. Value of the labor of the poor employed is $185. Value of the produce of said farm during the year 1848, $500. So for the cost of the building and the versus the labor and produce of what they were getting on it is not really equating out. They certainly were not making any sort of a profit with in Washtenaw County in the 1840s. This is a picture of what it looked like for many years. This is in the Atlas map of Washtenaw County, published in 1874. So we have, I believe this side is the poorhouse, and then this part right here is considered the insane asylum. And this building would eventually go away later on, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But this is sort of, if you look at any images of the facility, this is what the one that you're normally going to find in newspapers or other different books about their county's poorhouse. Now looking at Oakland County as a comparison, they seem to move around a lot. They can never sort of stick with one spot. So 1834 is when they appointed a committee to find a suitable property. They first started purchase property in the northeast quarter of Section 2 of Waterford Township for a little over $1,000 in 1835. It was ready for occupancy in May of that year, and then they occupied it from 1835 to 1857. So looking at the map here of Waterford Township, Pontiac is just down here, and on the north side, that's where the first poorhouse was. Then down here in 1857, it was moved to the northeast quarter, west half, southeast quarter, and southwest quarter of Section 27. And then 3 years later, they stopped using it, and they ended up farming out the paupers that were at the poorhouse. So they must have found it really wasn't serving a purpose, that they were able to just farm out people to other farmers and pay them to support them instead of actually having an institution to do that. Kent County did the same thing. They had a poorhouse from 1840 to 1847 and then decided, you know, we've only got a few people here. It's not really worth paying for all this institution when we can just farm it out. But then a few years later, in 1864, they discontinued the farming out of it and then purchased property in Section 35 and part of Section 26, and that property was used until 1866. So they went back to utilizing a poorhouse. An early description of theirs, so in that same 1849 listing, it talks about how it cost $655, had 80 acres, 68 improved, but the value of the produce raised during it was only $387.50 compared to what it was for the cost of the actual purchase of it. And then they finally picked a spot and stuck with it. So finally they picked in Section 24 of Waterford Township and a portion of Section 19. That's where the good way to kind of recognize where it's at is it's right next to where the highway was. And then they purchased that in 1866, followed by the other Section 19 portion of it in 1869, with buildings erected between 1866 and 1867. So I've got here sort of this annual report narrative of what was going on at each poorhouse. Just some highlights, because I won't read everything in here. If you do want to, the Library of Michigan does have the annual reports abstract of all of these going from the 1870s up until the 1930s. So if you are looking at an individual poorhouse, you can find these types of narrative descriptions in them. And they'll talk about how that the facilities for bathing done, warming of the buildings were done by furnaces, and here it says it's not successful yet, and they also use stoves. And then they talk about the type of food that they had. So food substantial, plain and plenty, alternating various meats and fish, salt and fresh, together with bread, vegetables, fruit in season, and milk with soup once or twice each week. They talk about the same thing in Washtenaw counties, where pork and potatoes, bread, fish, beans with soup, and vegetables alternating with tea and coffee compose the general diet. Each of them will get good, comfortable clothing to suit the season. They even mention in here the treatment of the insane and idiotic as good as we can give without any reasonable facilities for taking care of them. So they did not have a separate facility for taking care of the mentally ill, unlike what it was at Washtenaw County, where they do mention that they do have good commodious building in which the insane and idiotic are kept with large yards attached for outdoor exercise when the weather will permit. So I guess that occasionally they will release them out into an open area for them to be outside, but otherwise they would be inside the building. You can also find statistics in these annual report abstracts that we have, and I've got here a couple of different counties listed, and we have both Oakland County. So in 1872 they had 120 people total as paupers that were received at their poorhouse. Washtenaw County had 287. The average number maintained, so the average number of people that were in the building at a time was 42 for Oakland County, and it averaged 89.5 at the Washtenaw County facility. So that's 90 people at a time in a farmhouse and a separate building for people with mental disabilities. And at that time, I'm sure it was just the poorhouse keeper and maybe one or two other folks that were helping out. A number of paupers under the age of 16. So Oakland, they had 19 during the year. In Washtenaw, they had 29. And then as far as the temporarily relieved outside of the poorhouses, neither of the counties gave any sort of statement as to what it was. But you can see for other counties, looking at Genesee County, they had 512 people in that year that they were helping outside of their poorhouse. Kent County, 185. Wayne County, 1,700 people in 1870 that they were having to support outside of their poorhouse. So we can look at some of the life at the poorhouse. We'll look, for example, here at Oakland County, and they mentioned here it was a model poorhouse. Such a one this county boasts facts regarding it. So even though things maybe were not the best, just looking at the statistics, you're at least finding examples of at that time, and this is in 1902, talking about how that things are going pretty well. And you will often find that usually there will, every once in a while, maybe every year or two, you'll find an article that talks about a poorhouse and gives a little bit more of a description of the type of food that they have there, the interior of the poorhouse, other different things that are going on there. So if you're looking at a particular county, the best time of the year to look is usually in October, because that tended to be always when their annual report was due. And you'll find that not only will the annual report be submitted to the Board of Supervisors, but often it might also get submitted either to the newspaper along with what gets submitted to the state. Something that's also kind of interesting about the poorhouse in Oakland is their animals that they had on there. So this is a document that I came across that's called the American Shorthorn Herd Book, Pedigrees of Shorthorn Cattle. And they mentioned in there a cow by the name of Compton Duke, owned by the Oakland County Poor Farm in Pontiac, and it talks about the whole, got by Gerald Duke, out of Lady Compton, by Lord Compton, so you can trace the actual history of some of the animals. And they also talk about how in the 1884 Pontiac Gazette talks about how they delivered a 3-year-old grade shorthorn steer, weighed a gross of 2,230 pounds. He is a very fine animal, a credit to the county farm. So even though we're looking at this place as a poorhouse, they were able to do some things with the type of animals that they have there. An example of one of the inmates that you'll find, this is one who was at the Oakland County Poorhouse, somebody by the name of Albert Wixom. One of the famous hermits of Wixom, living in an old tumble-down tavern, was taken to the Oakland County Poorhouse this week. Albert, who is stone blind, has a romantic history. He was jilted by his sweetheart, a rich Detroit banker's daughter, and has been a recluse with his brother Richard in their father's old tavern for over 30 years. So this is somebody who they identified as needing to go to the poorhouse. So this was in 1898, and then he died in 1906 at the poorhouse. So he spent the better part of about 8 years at the poorhouse. I've seen examples of people that were there for 20, 30 years just because they had no place else to go. As we're sort of transitioning now, we're starting to get into the late 1890s and early 1900s, and we're finding a change in starting how we're perceiving our poorhouses. So the Michigan State Constitution changes the designation of county poorhouses to county infirmaries. This is our one of the copies that we have at the State Library of our state constitution from 1909. And as we're getting this name change from poorhouses to county infirmaries, it's sort of in recognition of the fact that we're not just treating them as body warehouses. It's now actually a place that has to have some sort of medical purpose, or just at least a better understanding of how to treat people that are there with some forms of mental disabilities. So in 1908, there was an article in the newspaper that talks about how the poor farm in Oakland was changed to the county infirmary, and you'll find other places that same sort of name change is occurring around that same time as a result of this state constitution change. Another example of an inmate, and this one was also at Oakland County. So this is William C. Elliott, the self-styled professor of ethics. 75 years old, died at the Oakland County home today. He came to Rochester 13 years ago from Indiana in an answer to an advertisement of a Rochester girl for a husband. Apparently there's a lot of jilted lovers that show up in the Oakland County area. I don't know what it's like in Washtenaw County. But it's, so he was rejected. He was an artist and a sketcher of ability, was a prolific writer, and sent many communications to newspapers. Last winter, he froze one of his feet, which bothered him greatly. He was taken to the county home. A month ago, gangrene caused his death. So that's something that you'll find. In fact, I know, met somebody who was at the, who worked at Kent County's Poorhouse when it became Maple Grove back in the 1960s. He was there as an orderly nurse, and he mentioned that there was somebody who had come in who had gangrene, and they were waiting for it to reach the point where they could actually just amputate the limb, just because there was really no means of actually stopping the progression of it. So as we're moving along, things that we're starting to change is a lot of facilities are going to start changing their buildings. In Kent County, they built a new building in 1892. In Washtenaw County, they voted to replace their Poorhouse building in 1916. So this is the listing in the Board of Supervisors for the October session, where they specifically say we're going to authorize the replacement of it. And this building was then completed the following year in 1917. So if anybody still remembers that facility, I think a lot of people are going to recognize this building if they were ever driving around that area. And it kind of represents what you'll find with a lot of other Poorhouse buildings, where you have sort of the office section right here, and then on one side it's primarily devoted to just the male inmates, and then the other side it would be for the female inmates. There was a very distinct separation between them. If you ever get a chance to go to Hartford and Van Buren County, their Poorhouse, the building is still there. It's being used as a museum, and it's a mirror. You look down the middle of it, and like everything that's on one side is mirrored on the other side, because you had the sexes separated. The only time they ever interacted with each other was in the dining halls or a few other sort of common areas. Now, what resulted with Oakland changing their building was not because, oh, it's old, we need to change it. No, it's because of a fire. So they had a fire in 1918 that destroyed $40,000 worth of the two buildings. And something that was interesting there is they had 85 people that were in it, and it says here the 8 were confined to the hospital portion of it. The latter were rescued with difficulty, some even resisting being taken to safety, declaring that as their only home was about to be lost, they might as well go with it. So they were like, I'm coming, Elizabeth, just take me. So they had a bit of difficulty, but luckily they were able to save everyone from that fire in 1918, despite the fact that it was filled with 85 people in the building. And what sort of resulted in that is they had to throw together a building in order to handle these people. And what ended up happening is in the few years after that, they never got around to actually building a building in order to handle the number of people that were there. So you'll start finding newspaper articles talking about how that says even here that Royal Oak Women says jails are better fixed, blames county when it comes to the facility that they used as a replacement, and that it was just inhospitable for people to be living in, and that they needed to do something in order to better handle the type of facility that they really needed. The Firma Infirmary is nothing but wooden shacks with no adequate provisions made to take care of the men and women who are crowded into it. So then that resulted in this building right here. This was constructed in 1925 for a cost of $327,000, designed to accommodate 125 patients and 3 staff members. Hopefully they had more than just 3 staff members to handle 125 people. But if you go out there today, this building still does exist, just as a teaser of what ended up with that facility in the end. Another example I found kind of interesting, I know I'm focusing primarily on Oakland County folks here. I promise I will have a couple Washtenaw people, but this woman was kind of interesting. She was an 81 years old who was found and brought to the Oakland County Infirmary. The problem with her is that she had family in Lowell. So you've got Oakland County, somebody trying to get to Kent County, and she said, like, I'm leaving. I am not staying here. And they ended up finding her. Sunday she left the institution. A passing motorist picked her up and carried her as far as Owasso, where the car was in an accident. She suffered 3 broken ribs. And they ended up having to have an ambulance return her to the county infirmary. She was just trying to get back to where she perceived as home. And so she could have been dealing with issues of mental deficiencies, Alzheimer's, any of that sort of thing. And somehow she was just trying to escape to get back to where she thought was home. Another one, so to get an example of a Washtenaw person, this guy, I found his this article only just within the past few days. So it talks about a guy by the name of Edward Fines who was able to receive a discharge showing his prison sentence was completed, even though he actually served 1 year of a 10-year term. So what had happened was that he was convicted in Flint in 1918 for manslaughter following an altercation with knives in which his opponent was fatally stabbed. He was sentenced to the Ionia Reformatory, so the state prison there. A year later, he escaped. It is believed he remained for several years in the vicinity of Ionia. At any rate, he finally appeared at the Ann Arbor Hospital, an automobile accident necessitating the amputation of both legs and an arm. He is now at the Washtenaw County Poor Farm. So somebody trying to escape prison, and he ends up having to go to the poorhouse because he was a bit of a wreck. Those are some articles of some people that were from the 19-teens and 1920s. Now we're starting to get into the time period of the Great Depression, which you're really going to see an uptick for many facilities because of the greater poverty and just worldwide what was impacting everybody. And so we'll do a little bit of a comparison between Oakland and Washtenaw counties, and I thought that was actually kind of interesting. So if you look at 1925 and the late 1920s, Oakland had 141 people during that year in their facility. Washtenaw, it was 85. It starts growing much more in Oakland County. Eventually, before the stock market crash, it was 444, and yet only 92 in Washtenaw County. But then once the Great Depression hits, then it starts picking up. So we've got 757, 858 was the max in 1932 for who was at the number of people at Oakland County. And then the max number at Washtenaw was 290. And then it starts jumping back down to the lower 200s. And then in Oakland County, it went down and then went back up again. So it's interesting, there's statistics you can find for every county in this time period that the state did some research on. And I would be curious why the big difference between Oakland versus Washtenaw. Was it just because of the general population numbers? Was it because so many people had flocked more to that part of the state for the auto industry, different things like that? So it certainly brings out more questions when you're looking at impacts between different counties. Another person I thought was kind of interesting with Oakland too is that a person who they had go there not because of well, what had happened is that a woman who was working for a guy ended up poisoning him. And as a result of the poisoning, he ended up being sent to the Oakland County Poorhouse because there was no place else for him to go. And she ended up being sent to jail as a result of it. And it also brought up another instance where her husband had also mysteriously died. So maybe we had a a serial poisoner. I don't know. I haven't been able to find too much into it, but it just kind of shows some of the other instances of what brings people to poorhouses, that they were a victim of poisoning. Another thing in 1930s that the state did is they did a report of all of the county infirmaries at that time, and there's an article that I found in the Lansing State Journal that covers the entire report. I haven't been able to find the actual report itself. I'm assuming we have it somewhere at the State Library or State Archives, but they do mention in their specific counties who they talk about that are having some overcrowding issues. In this area, they talk about Allegan, Otsego, Isabella, Huron, Clinton, Delta, Elgin, and Kalamazoo counties, all having overcrowding. Baraga counties is reported during the winter months that it's being overcrowded. And then when they get into other ones where they talked about where they were praised, and counties receiving commendation for the care given to their charges: Oakland, Grand Traverse, Alpena, Kent, Genesee, Charlevoix, Clare, Cass, Berry, Ogama, Kigoma, Dickinson, Saginaw, Iron, Lenawee, Ingham, and Ionia. Now, Washtenaw County wasn't mentioned in here in either bad or good, so maybe they were just okay? I don't know. If I ever get the chance to find the full report, it might say, but it's just something interesting during the time of the Depression and the New Deal that they were trying to evaluate what was going on in all these institutions in order to see what needed to change. And even though Oakland had a listing in that report of things going well, for some reason, the Oakland Infirmary officials were removed. Supervisors act after hearing charges of inhumane treatment of inmates, so all of a sudden the people that were in charge were kicked out. So that's something that also prompts a little bit more research into how things were being perceived at maybe the state level versus what was going on more at the local level. A few years later, in 1939, this is where we have another complete reorganization. The Michigan Welfare Reorganization Act of 1939 abolished the county superintendents of the poor, and this is where we established the county departments of social welfare in all of Michigan counties. So if you're looking at what is probably now an early snapshot of what we deal with today, this would be a good representation of what that is. Because by this point, we no longer have the State Board of Corrections and Charities. We now have things that are it's now been morphed into the state I think it's the State Department of Welfare, and then having these local welfare departments. I know there's a lot of text just kind of showing a lot of the reorganizations of what it was before 1839, and then after the reorganization. I'm just putting it up here to just show that we no longer have the county superintendents of the poor, and we now have it under the Department of Social Welfare. And just to kind of show some of the other things that we had in the past. So under the probate court, we had mother's pensions, hospitalization of afflicted adults, afflicted children, and crippled children, the Soldiers and Sailors Relief Commission, dependent, neglected, and delinquent children. Now it's changing into things like where it's old age assistance. This is where we're starting to get, I think, those federal dollars that are starting to pay for Social Security and other different things like that. Aid to the blind, other assistance in the probate court, and hospitalization of afflicted adults. So we get a change, certainly in the name, and then a reorganization, and it's going to be like that for a number of decades following that. Just something that I thought was really cool that I found not that long ago was these aerial images of the Washtenaw County Infirmary. So this is that building right here, and the other farming buildings that are right here. So this is that 1917 building that's right here, and this would be all the farmland that was right here. And I think this is that little section on the Ann Arbor Township area that they also owned. So these were pictures I think were taken in 1949. We're also finding, now that we're getting into 1950s, an even more greater evaluation of the system is going on to kind of make things that we've recognized now the need for better medicinal care for folks, but now we also need to find other types of things that people aren't just, as they refer to it in this article right here, as the rocking chair existence. What this is, much can be done with little to bring light to aged lives. This was part of a report that was done by the University of Michigan, and they did some research at the Washtenaw County Infirmary. Right here, it mentions that in there, and it's showing about how we need to have more programs to make these institutions more of a home, more of a place that when people are there, that it's got a greater sense of community, whether or not it's got physical therapy, whether or not we have, something as simple as, just weekly activities for people to participate in. This is where we start getting into, it could be anything from, art clubs to, travel away from the facility with the people that are there. And this is also at a time where the people that were more under the elderly age are no longer there. They're being either put into different institutions, or they're going to be try to be more kept at home rather than at the poorhouse. So we're starting to see the introduction of more as a retirement home rather than as a county infirmary. Even more changes going on. This is where we start finding more of the names being changed. So like the Oakland County Infirmary started referring to itself as the Oakland County Medical Care Facility. Ann Arbor with the Washtenaw County Infirmary in 1951, this is where they sold off all of their animals. So they were no longer incorporating animals in support of the institution, and you'll find in other counties that were doing the same thing. In 1957, that's when Kent County auctioned everything off. So around that time, they were no longer, even the sale will end dairy operations by the county. So apparently they were even, selling milk to the local community. With Washtenaw County, they eventually closed it in 1971 due to the fact of just the high cost that would be required for modernizing the facility, and then the building was later demolished in 1979. With Oakland County, it was slightly different. This is where they were realizing they needed to have more skilled care. They also then changed it so that it was no longer called the Oakland County Medical Care Facility. It changed to being called Golden Oaks. And that was in 2005 when that name changed. And the requirements of just more different types of services was recognized. This article was in 1982. So we're seeing even more of the modernization being represented with these this time period. But then we also get to private ownership, and you'll find that with many institutions at this time period. So what happened in 2006 for Oakland County, they sold it to a Southfield-based Sienna Healthcare Management Institution, and the purchase agreement stated that Oakland County would contract services with Sienna for 3 years, followed by the county relinquishing control of Golden Oaks and the promise of Sienna building a new facility. They then eventually replaced Golden Oaks with Regency at Waterford, which is located on the corners of Dixie Highway and Telegraph Road in 2011. That's a picture of what it looks like today. And in many ways, I think that also represents what other counties were doing as well. Looking at what's now there today, looking at Washtenaw County, has anybody ever been to County Farm Park? Yes. Yes, that's the Poorhouse property. So this is the aerial image that you find on Google Maps. So the Washtenaw County Parks and Rec building is right here, which is roughly where the Poorhouse building would have been. And this is the entire trail system that they have out there. So it's all now started to grow more into greater vegetation. I've been out there before. It's a really nice park. If you get a chance and you haven't been there, I certainly encourage you to do it. And then, so this is just some other pictures that I took of the one time that I was out there. They don't really mention the Poorhouse very much, other than just in one or two of the plaques that they have out there for the garden areas. And this barn, I haven't been able to determine whether or not it was part of the facility, but just the age of it seemed to strike me as potentially being from the county infirmary when it was still being used there. And then if you go out to Oakland, it's all become the county complex. You've got the animal shelter, you've got the court, you've got the farmer's market, you've got the railroad that's right here. That building that I showed you the picture of earlier, that's it right there, which is in this section of the property. And this is some pictures of what it looks like. So if you go out there today, you can see it's very, when they built it, they did a really nice job. It's got some really distinct architectural features of it, and it's now being used as the Circuit Court Probation Office, the MSU Extension Service, and the 4-H Youth Development and Veteran Services. And it's also important to note that they had a cemetery just near their property on the other side of the railroad, and you can access it. It's kind of hidden. This is a picture that a couple pictures that I took. Most all of the plots are not marked, or at least not marked in the way that you can easily identify who's there. And there was a newspaper article in the Detroit Free Press in 2006 that talks about, at the time, it was 140 years old, started in 1866. It would be 154 years now. The ledger list, there was over 1,187 people there. They stopped accepting bodies in 1972, and burials were not only from the county infirmary, but also from the Pontiac State Mental Hospital, and then other unclaimed bodies that were from the Oakland County area, and most graves are only identified with a numbered stone. Okay. Does anybody have any questions so far on Oakland or Washtenaw County facilities? I also have a few slides here on just talking about researching an inmate, but I wanted to give anybody a chance if they had.
I was just wondering, is Mayberry, down the street, down 8 Mile, is that in Wayne County or is that in Washtenaw County? I'm not sure.
Mayberry?
It's a state park now. However, it used to be the tuberculosis sanatorium because I had an aunt that was there. Okay.
Well, the TB hospitals are going to be completely different. Okay. You may find some TB cases at some poorhouses early on, but a lot of times counties would develop their own separate TB hospitals, or you would also have people that were sent to like Howell, which was where the state tuberculosis hospital was. So that's a completely separate institution. Yes?
If a couple was sent to a poorhouse, were they separate?
Yep. Yep. They would be put to separate. Maybe later on, if the facility could handle it, they would allow couples to stay together, but more often than not, they would be separated.
What about their children?
I think with those instances, they either fostered them out to someplace else. It just depended on what the county chose to do. I think with, like in the Grand Rapids area, they utilized like St. John's Home and the Blodgett House, which are the two orphan asylums that were there. And so if you had a family that were in an instance of having to go to the poorhouse, I think you would have the parents at the poorhouse, but then the kids would be sent elsewhere. Yeah.
Qualified people to go to the poorhouse. And who made the decision?
That was either the 3 people that made that decision were either the superintendents of the poor, the township supervisors, or officials within city government, or the actual poor farm keeper. That would make that decision. Now, people could leave. You would find a lot of instances where people would only be there in like the winter, because during the summer they could stay outside and not have to be inside because of the cold, or that would only be in the winter. But yeah, I think in instances where they were institutionalized, like you had multiple people saying like this person needs to go here, and then it would go through the probate court, and then the probate court would make that declaration of like, this person is institutionalized, which leads, certainly a good thing if you're researching somebody and you're not sure if they were at a poorhouse inmate, look for the probate record, because that would definitively state whether or not they were a ward of the county or eventually had to go on to another institution.
So some of these people would be the equivalent of today's homeless?
Yeah. They'd come and go, you know, there's an instance that I know of in Kent counties where you would have guys who would leave and they would go look for golf balls over at the golf course down the road over at Indian Trails Golf Course, which was like, you know, 3 or 4 blocks away. Find golf balls, sell them, have enough to get alcohol, go to the local watering hole, get drunk, and then have to work their way back at like 2 a.m. in the morning to somehow make it back to the poorhouse. And they'd get lost, and they would knock on people's doors of like, hey, where am I? Which way do I go? And you would just have people that were like, you're you know, about 200 feet away on the other side of the road over there. Yeah, because you had such limited staff, there was no way that you could fully, you know, regulate that people had to stay in the facility. Just to kind of talk a little bit more about if you're researching an inmate, just a couple slides. Now, locations of poorhouse records are going to vary. You're going to want to start with the county government, that they're either going to be at the courthouse or at some sort of archival facility. Some records have been donated to either local, university, or state archival collections. I know for Washtenaw County, I think some things have been donated to the University of Michigan Bentley Library. I know the state archives has a fair number of things that are there as well, so you can look there. Others can be found at the offices of the institution that replaced the poorhouse, such as a local nursing home, or you may need to research the last director or superintendent of the poorhouse, because they may have, their descendants may have retained the records. It's not something that was required under some sort of retention policy. And unfortunately, others have been either lost or destroyed. Like Sanilac counties, there was I think a leak in the roof, and a lot of records in the clerk's office ended up just being tossed out because, you know, they felt they were not worth preserving, and that was in the, I think the 70s or 80s, something like that. This is the Will Carlton Poorhouse. It's in Hillsdale County, so if you ever heard of Over the Hill to the Poorhouse, the poem, that's the poorhouse that is based on. You'll certainly want to look through things like the County Board of Supervisor proceedings. Those will either be in a bound book, or you can find where they were listed in the newspaper. Kent County's was pretty good at listing them in the newspaper. They would often be at certain times of the year, so like around February, June, and October. And you'll sometimes even find, maybe you'll get lucky to find actual transcripts, but oftentimes it's just a summary of what was done at the meeting. These things, the annual reports of the superintendents of the poor, these are some really cool things if you can find them. These were the yearly reports that each poor department had to put together, and it lists everything from the number of people that were there, the causes of pauperism. So in 1929 in Kent County, they had everybody who was either feeble-minded, broken limb, blindness, old age, and temperance, sore leg, paralysis, sickness, all the way to syphilis, crippled, desertion, cancer. They even had one person who was born at the county infirmary. And I've seen a birth record of somebody who that has happened before. An unwed mother would be sent out to the poorhouse as a means of sort of hiding them away because of the fact they were unmarried when they conceived their child. Other things from like burials and deaths to the summary of different expenditures, the types of expenses that they had on clothing or funeral costs, or, you know, electrics and lights and telephones, different things like that. The abstracts that are sort of the summary of all of those reports we have at the State Library, and I referred to a couple of those in some of my earlier slides, talk about everything from like the total cost to the narrative, listing or statements of what's been going on there. Sometimes you'll even get the list of the superintendents by counties. So this is an example just of one from Ingham County, but we've already seen some examples of these a little bit earlier. So this talked about where it was located, bathing facilities, and other different things like that. And here's They say theirs is a district school joining the farm, but as a rule, all children who are eligible are sent to the cold water school. So kind of back to your question earlier, in Ingham County's case, they would send the kids to cold water. And it didn't matter if their parents were there with them or not, or at the facility or not. Another really interesting thing is the Proceedings of the Convention of the State Association of Superintendents of the Poor, which is a really long name for basically the association that all of the poorhouse keepers and superintendents of the poor are part of. It's like how librarians have the American Library Association, or plumbers have some sort of an association that they're part of. And every year they would have a convention, and these would even have the transcripts of different institutions, and they would even be verbatim of what was even talked about. And a county that you're interested in where maybe an ancestor was at, you might find it being talked about in these records. The census, you're certainly going to want to look in there. So this is the Washtenaw County Census from 1870, so it took up 2 full pages for the people that were at theirs. Sometimes the population schedules are going to be at the end of a section for a county, so sometimes you can just jump to the end. Other times it would be amongst everybody else. By rule, poorhouse staff will be listed first, followed by the inmates, and also be aware that there will be inconsistencies with spelling of names and a lot of other different things, because many of these people, they were from overseas. They might be recent immigrants, and you're going to have a hard time translating what's coming in everything from Polish to German to Scandinavian, any other language that you can think of, depending on what the trends for immigration was at the time. You'll find names just get butchered all throughout the census. Another census that's separate from the regular population one is the federal census for the defective, dependent, and delinquent classes, which is one that they did as a supplemental one in 1880. It lists all the people in a county who are insane, idiots, deaf mutes, blind, homeless children, inhabitants, and the pauper and indigent. And this is for Oakland County in 1880, and some of the reasons why people were at the poorhouse were crippled in hip, crippled in leg, one side paralyzed, and a bunch of people that were old age. You'll have other things listed in there as well. Consumption, what's consumption? Tuberculosis. Prior to those TB hospitals coming into existence, a lot of different reasons for why people will be there, and this may be one of your only instances of where that's actually described for a person. Other newspaper articles, you will find that some poorhouse individuals, even though it's a separate place away from town, some of them may get some notoriety, or they may have had notoriety in their past, and even though they were at the poorhouse, people will still remember who they are. So the Lansing State Journal in 1935 mentions the funeral rites for Ernest Brown, last of old coachman Wednesday, unable to meet demands of old age, venerable Negro dies at County Farm. And this is his gravestone that's at the Ingham County Poor Farm Cemetery. And he's got like a whole quarter of a page just devoted to him, just because of what he was known for prior to going to this institution. Looking on death records, always be aware of different clues to look for of where the person died, who the informant was, the location of the burial. They will also lead you to maybe to some death notices. So like this person, Lydia Webb, listed as having died at the Ingham County Poor Farm Monday, and the body was sent to Ann Arbor Monday night. Any guess why? Why it would be sent to Ann Arbor from Lansing? Medical. Some of the poor farms would send their bodies for medical, medical science. Other recommended supplemental reading, early on ones, The Almshouse Construction and Management by Alexander Johnson, The American Poor Farm and Its Inmates by Harry C. Evans. A good one that just gives a great overview of all of Michigan poor law by Isabel Campbell Bruce and Edith Eichhoff, which was published in 1936. In the Shadow of the Poorhouse, A Social History of Welfare in Michigan is kind of one of those go-to ones on the national scale. If you can find it, Almshouses and Mental Institutions in Michigan, 1871 to 1930, is a dissertation. by Catherine Jean Whitaker that she did for her degree in 1986 from the University of Michigan. I found it in a few places, and when I did find it, I scanned the whole thing because it's not in like true publication as a book. And then a more recent one is the Poorhouse, America's Forgotten Institution by David Wagner that was published in 2005. There's other books that exist out there that focus on just caring for the poor or caring for the elderly, but these are ones that sort of compile all that into how we took care of people at poorhouses. Nothing specifically has really been published on like Michigan other than what Whitaker did. So in my lifetime, maybe if I get a chance to write something, I could, I don't know, we'll see. And that's about it. I apologize, I went a little bit farther than probably what was advertised. I think we were supposed to only go to 7:30. So does anybody have any other questions? Did I blow your minds with too much information?
Well, where exactly is this library in Lansing?
So the state library is on Kalamazoo. 702 Kalamazoo is our address. We are in, the best way to describe where we're at is if you look for the building that's got a big white pine tree in the middle of it, that's us. Because there's no other building in Lansing that has a pine tree in the middle of it. The tree's name is Carl. He's very nice. Giant pine tree, and we're in between, let's see, it's going to be Kalamazoo, Butler, Allegan, and Pine. If you go during the week, you have to pay for parking, but it's open on Saturdays and parking is free. Any other questions? Any questions about other counties, poorhouses, poorhouses in general? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned Livingston is in Marion Township, which I have relatives in Marion Township.
Yeah.
Is that still existing?
The cemetery is there. If I remember correctly, the cemetery is sort of enclosed in a sort of a, not a condo complex, but a sort of like a home association area, and it's in a fenced-in area, so you can find it. It's just, I think maybe about a mile or two south of Howell on near County Farm Road. So yeah, it shouldn't be that hard to find. And afterwards I can show you on a map where it's at.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Traverse City converted their old county homes to a nice shopping and residential area.
Well, that's the asylum. That's different than the poorhouse.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. But you're right. It's if you get a chance to go to the asylum, I had some of the best cheesecake and wine up there, and I'd love to go on the ghost tour. I haven't had a chance to do that yet.
Was going to be, I guess, have any other counties or parts of the state done that with their county asylums or
poorhouses?
Sort of to a point where they're still there to be viewed.
Not really. There are some that are still in existence, other than Hartford, which uses theirs as a museum. Ottawa County has turned theirs, like the barns are still there, and it's a park, a lot like the County Farm Park in Ann Arbor. Some are being, a couple of them are being used as either apartments. If you go to Clinton counties and St. John's, theirs is being used as apartments. I think Cass County is, or the one that's in Cassopolis, theirs is being used as lower tier apartments. But outside of that, I have not come across any that are restored other than the one in Hartford. And the one in Hartford's from 1884. If you go up to the one that's in Houghton County by Michigan Tech, it's on private property, so you have to ask to go there, and the guy who owns it said the property is worth a lot of money because it's got like $250,000 worth of gravel underneath it, and he's just never had a chance to mine it all out. So, yes, sir.
How about Godperson Road, where it stops at Geddes in Washtenaw County? There used to be a hospital in there.
Okay, that might have been a different...
When I was a kid, that was a place you didn't want to go in there.
Okay. That might have been either maybe the TB hospital or something different, but that kind of stigma that you're talking about, that really kind of applied to a lot of the poorhouse. Yeah, you did not fool around. You had folks that were saying, your parents saying to you, you don't want to end up at that kind of institution. Well, if anybody does want to come up to me individually afterwards, you're more than welcome to, but I thank you for your time and appreciate your attention, and thank you very much.